Hello, everybody. Hello, and welcome back to A House Divided, coming to you from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. If it's on our shelves, it's history. My name is Bjorn Skaptison. I shall be the administrator, the producer for today's event. And in a moment, you will meet our author, C.W. Goodyear, the author of President Garfield. We'll get to the details with Charlie Goodyear here in just a second. But first, I want to remind everybody watching this live stream on our Facebook account that you are not just watching a fascinating discussion with a great author of a great new biography. You are at a book signing. You are at a book signing event, and you can order a signed first edition copy of President Garfield by Charlie Goodyear, and we will ship it right out to you. Thank you, Charlie, for signing those book plates for us. And yeah, Dan has an example of the signed book plate right there. So this is not just you looking at your phone or your computer. It's a good old-fashioned book signing. I think that's just about everything I have, Daniel. If you're ready to get this interview started with Charlie Goodyear, then I will introduce everybody at home to your host for this episode of A House Divided, Daniel Weinberg of Abraham Lincoln Bookshop.
Thank you, Bjorn. I'm Daniel Weinberg at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. I'm sitting in our broadcast studio, and you are watching A House Divided. And we're honored to have a wonderful book today by Charlie Goodyear. This is the book. Bjorn has shown this to you before too. And I didn't know how blue Garfield's eyes were until I saw this dust jacket. But there it is. And of course, we will have signed first editions with Charlie's signature on our special book plate. And Charlie is an author, an historian, a graduate of Yale, and this is his first book, and a wonderful narrative biography. It has garnered praise from Pulitzer Prize winners James McPherson and John Gaddis, and also General Stanley McChrystal put a wonderful blurb on, whom I think Charlie worked with in Washington for a while, and Walter Isaacson as well has a beautiful blurb on the back giving it high praise, as did Kirksus. And if you get a Kirksus review, that's the thing. Congratulations, Charlie. So this is his first biography of President Garfield, from radical to unifier. It's a Simon & Schuster book, 610 pages, illustrated, and costs $35 to obtain, and worth every penny of it. Now, talking about Pulitzer winners, there have been a number of Pulitzer winners that have worked on President Garfield before you. Margaret Leach, for one. Alan Peskin gave a classic biography some years ago on Garfield, as did Robert Caldwell for the American Political Leaders series that was edited by a Pulitzer winner, Alan Nevins. All of them wrote on Garfield. So what is it, Charlie, that brought them, and now you, to a biography of a 3-month president?
Thank you. And I first want to say that I'm very appreciative to you and Bjorn for having me on. I've long been a fan of A House Divided, so I find myself in the bizarre position of being a fan who's now on the show. But that's a very good question, and it's one that I've wrestled with for, I'd say, hundreds of times. I've been asked, why Garfield? Why President Garfield? And the answer as to why I found him interesting, it's a bit indirect. 5 years ago, which is when I started work on this book, I was working as a writer in Washington, D.C., and I was naturally very interested, given where I was geographically and where the country was societally. I was interested in finding a period of American history where the social conditions of that time were maybe not exactly like our own today, but there was enough comparable divisive spirits in the air of America of that time, politically, socially, economically. And I wanted to find someone of that era who was leading the nation in a way that defied those divisive spirits. So I was drawn in my research, and I started my work at the Library of Congress, to Reconstruction in the Gilded Age, so the post-Civil War and then the post-Civil War. And throughout that time, throughout those years, I found floating in the background of so many major events of that time, the same individual. And not only that, it was somebody who everybody of that period, regardless of their own politics, was saying vaguely nice things about. And that person happened to be James Garfield. And then the closer I got to that life, the more compelled I was to study it in better detail. Garfield was often distilled into a single line in the historical record. He would be referred to in passing as future president, would be assassinated within his first 6 months, really, of office. But the deeper I dug, the less right that seemed as the record. He led what I think to be now one of the most compelling and impressive personal political rises to power, certainly in 19th century America, but maybe of the entire span of our nation's history. There's a quote, actually, from President Rutherford Hayes, another one of these forgotten presidents of the Gilded Age. And this is Hayes describing Garfield. And Hayes wrote, "The truth is, no man ever started so low who accomplished so much in all of our history. Not Benjamin Franklin or Abraham Lincoln, even." And I regret to be saying that to you of the Abraham Lincoln bookstore. But if you know presidents like I do, it's rare for one to say such a nice thing about another. And so I, quite by accident, found what I think to be a very, very lucky biographical find just from a writing perspective. And you rightly point out that great histories have been written on him. Leach and Peskin were pretty much the last authors to take a full swing at a life to death Garfield biography. There's been a little bit more popular scholarship recently about his death. But one of my hopes with this book was to write about the full scale of a grand and rich American life.
You know, Robert Caldwell, who wrote for the, as I said, for the American Political Leaders series, wonderful set of books, by the way. He stated this: a summary of the course of American political history from 1861 to 1881 was really Garfield, that he encompassed what he was a summary of that period. Would you then agree with that?
I would absolutely agree, yes. In 1861, Garfield is, he had been raised by a single mother in a log cabin in rural Ohio, and he'd risen to become a state senator, a college president, and an abolitionist preacher. And then over the next 20 years, he goes through this remarkable ascent. He becomes, at the time of his promotion, the youngest brigadier general in the Union Army. Then partway through the war, he becomes technically the second youngest congressman in the country, and he's a radical Republican. He is one of Thaddeus Stevens's ilk. He's one of these thorough Reconstructionists. And then you fast forward 2 decades, and Garfield is pretty much the last radical, or maybe in his case, we say former radical, who's still on the national political stage. And James Blaine, who is a very compelling figure of that time, the famous Magnetic Man of Maine, would later publish a book compiling all of Garfield's congressional speeches from that era. And Blaine wrote that these Garfield speeches were, as he put it, an invaluable compendium on the most important era through which this government has ever passed. And so I think that's entirely right. And in between those things, Garfield becomes this key, this is what really distinguished him for me. He becomes this key pragmatist in an increasingly irrational and factionalized American political age. And so he was also a great witness to his time, a phenomenal and thorough writer, a great diarist. And so I think you're right. He's an excellent witness to, Caldwell is right, I should say. he was just a phenomenal witness to that neglected, I think, and transformative span of American history.
I found the other day in my own library at home a book that I thought I would, this is kind of an aside a bit, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Not all presidents have children's books written about them. Garfield was one, and here is one by Bill Stevens. I really got it because I love the dust jacket, but this is written for children, as Stevens usually did. Was he that sort of a role model for children?
He became that, yes, because especially by the time that he was running for president in 1880, or I should say he was in many ways forced to run for president against his will in some cases, his arc was heavily bind for political reasons as being an example of a rags to riches American dream story. Again, just to recap, Garfield was born in 1831 in the Western Reserve of Ohio, which was still in that time kind of a frontier region of the country. Never knew his father. His father died when Garfield was about 2. James Garfield was actually not even the first James Garfield of his family. Future President James Garfield was named after an elder sibling who died before he was born. And then throughout his youth, he was raised by a single mother, but he had to work a variety of manual labor jobs. And one of these jobs was to work on the Ohio Canal, which was this very prominent infrastructure project of the region of the time. And that symbolism of him being this young canal boy who eventually ended up to become president, there was a lot of just romance that was woven into that when he ran for president. And so he became a very easy and inspiring story for Americans to tell their children. When these campaign biographies of him came out in 1880, the titles were from the canal to the White House, because it was seen as this nice, rustic, almost Horatio Alger-esque encapsulation of the American dream. Now, the full story was more complicated, and Garfield never really got over the difficulties of his childhood. He would often wonder, and I think this is true of a lot of Americans who start from a low place in our society and end up doing very well. He would always wonder what more he could have accomplished had he been born, as he put it, to a father and some wealth, which is bizarre to me, at least given my own lived experiences. But for somebody who had been all of these things, that in their late 20s, he was already an influential politician in Ohio. He then became this daring general, this revolutionary congressman. He founded the first federal Department of Education as a congressman even. He was a Supreme Court attorney. He wrote articles for The Atlantic, and he also authored an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem that my mathematician friends tell me is very impressive. But for somebody to go through all that and then become president, and then still ask themselves, what more could I have done had I been born to a privileged upbringing? That's very interesting to me. But more impressive, I think, than from the log cabin to the White House is the fact that Garfield, when he moved into the White House, he brought his mom with him. So his mom provided for him when he was young, and in her old age, he managed to bring this old woman from a log cabin to the White House as well.
I was going to ask a question here because we were talking about books, but I'm first going to ask and jump ahead. Lucretia, she was happy, known as Crete. Was she happy with having her mother-in-law in the White House with her? How did that work out?
I've asked around, and Lucretia, Crete's most famous quality was, or at least most useful quality throughout her life, sometimes to her detriment, was patience. And she never, it seemed, questioned the presence of the woman who is popularly known as Grandma Garfield, Garfield's mom, in the White House, and even in their home in Washington before they moved into the White House. James's mom was a permanent presence in their home, and Lucretia never really made much of a deal about it. One of the things that James always said about his wife, when asked about it by a journalist or a member of the press, he would say, he would use the same phrase over and over again. He would say, "I have been wonderfully blessed with the discretion of my wife. She is unstampedable." And that phrase, unstampedable, is carrying a lot of weight because it implies, I think, there was reason to stampede at numerous times. But Lucretia was, I think, in many ways, maybe more impressive than her husband.
Well, she had to be patient because they were separated quite amount of time
They
with
were.
his career, both the war and as a politician. So I know she was not especially happy. You bring that out in the book.
I do. Yeah, I couldn't help but doing it because it seemed like at the end of their lives, and they were popularly remembered as being the epitome of what a presidential marriage should be. But at the beginning of their lives together, it was the exact opposite. It was maybe one of the most troubled marriages of presidential history at the very beginning. And Garfield entered into it passively. He wrote in his diary entry on the night he was married, he didn't write, "I married Lucretia Rudolph." He wrote, "I was married to Lucretia Rudolph," which I think says quite a lot. And later he cheats on her. He has an affair in wartime Washington. But then again, you flash forward to the end of his life and he writes, "They used to say that all roads led to Rome. In the directory of my life, all roads lead to Crete." And when he had been shot, when he was dying in the White House, the person he held out for, at least in the early days where it didn't seem that he would make it another night, he was waiting for Lucretia to return to his side. That was what doctors perceived he was doing. He was waiting for her to be by his side before he died.
We were talking about books before, and before we get away from that subject, I want to talk about his library. He had a huge library, estimated for that age, especially at least 2,500 books. Most of them are still in Lawndale, which is Lawnfield, excuse me, which is in Mentor, Ohio. And most of the books are still there. Some did get out. And his books, if you're trying to collect presidential books, his is one of the more difficult ones to get. I happen to have one.
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh.
Poetry of Germany, 1856. And maybe it's difficult to see his penciled signature there.
Wow,
but
that's
there it
phenomenal.
is. And
Yeah.
here is one of the two book plates that he used,
Oh my gosh.
showing the shelf number and where it was on the shelf. So this poetry book, in beautiful condition, actually, did get out. What were his reading habits, and what did he collect? We do know, of course, Shakespeare, just like Lincoln, and Lincoln would quote Shakespeare at the drop of a sonnet, and you drop Shakespeare into each of your chapters of your book at the beginning, something that Garfield would have said.
Yes, and that was actually one of the easiest editorial decisions of my writing career, because so this shows you what a literary man he was. So I mean, also what a phenomenal artifact you guys have there. That's terrific. But when I was reviewing his diary for the year 1878, I found in almost every day, Garfield opened the day's entry with a different Shakespearean verse. Which one, that's very refreshing, because I think to have an American politician who not only knows Shakespeare, but who can apply it to their day-to-day lives, that shows you're dealing, like with Lincoln, just a remarkable mind. But two, when I found that, I was like, oh, fantastic. This is great. I'm going to use these to open each chapter of my book. So that was my explanation for that. But as for what he collected, he was a monomaniacal reader, even from an early age, even when he was in that Ohio cabin. Garfield, as an old man, would still describe, or as old as he got, which was middle age, really, he would describe being able to still remember individual passages from these small books he would read as a child, as well as their page number. That was how much he internalized his reading. He was multilingual. You have that book of German poetry. He spoke German, French. He was pretty much fluent in Greek and Latin. He also spoke a little bit of Yiddish. And on the campaign trail, that actually ended up being a very good asset. I have parts of the book where Garfield is campaigning for president, and he's running into German canal workers, or these German industrial workers are coming to his doorstep to hear him speak, and he's greeting them in their native language. So he might have been, and I know these are perhaps fighting words, but I think he might have been one of the most purely intellectual people to ever be president. And there was very rarely a subject that he did not just want to just sink his teeth into intellectually. He read widely of poetry, drama. He read histories. He read military tactics. He was a hound for literature, and it makes me a little bit curious for what kind of memoir he could have wrote had he been allowed to live the full span of his life.
I think the same thing for Abraham Lincoln. Thank you.
Couldn't
I'd
agree
love
more.
to have had a memoir of him as well.
Yes.
What was his character like? What formed him? What were strengths and weaknesses? I know later on in his life, Grant, among others, thought he was spineless, but and he was certainly brave. He showed that in battle. Give us a elevator talk on his character and whom he was, and you might put in one of the stories that you write about the banana story.
Oh,
that
yeah.
certainly reveals a bit of his character.
It is. So what I'd say, the two characteristics that I think summarize him is actually something that was written of him after he got the presidential nomination. It was immediately after he was leaving Chicago, the site of his nomination, for home. And a journalist wrote that the Republican Party had no choice but to nominate Garfield. He was so aggressive and so conciliatory. So he was somebody who, I think, in their soul, he had profound passions. I've never encountered a historical figure who had such a blinding, almost religious zeal and optimism for the destiny of the Republic. That was a phrase of his in his inaugural address. And for what a righteous future vision of America needed to be, where all Americans of all kinds would have access to the civil liberties that were promised at our founding. So he had that terrific zeal. The other aspect of him that defined him was this conciliatoriness, and I'd summarize it as he was a pathologically reasonable person. He was somebody who, in a hyper-partisan Washington, and he was pretty much the only person who did this, would define his position on an issue by the spectrum of beliefs that was facing him from other sources. He alone would try very hard to heal divides between enemies, to keep everybody friendly, and at the expense of his own political well-being, would try to maintain unity on an issue and just keep what I'd say is the great gears of our government turning in opposition to partisanship. And so for that, because of that softness, because of that eternal pleasantness and this almost neurotic urge to be on good terms with everybody, you're right. Everyone from Ulysses Grant to Frederick Douglass, to all these reformist Republicans, to a lot of Democrats, despite being friendly with Garfield, he was minority leader by the Hayes administration, they would all say the same thing about him, which was that he was without what they called moral backbone, which, and that's a strange insult to be so common. So it implies that they all got together and talked about him behind his back, I think. But yes, in that banana story you referenced, it was a story about him going east to Williams College. That's where he ended up getting his undergraduate degree. And he is in Manhattan for the first time with a friend from rural Ohio, and he's entranced. They pass a fruit stall, and they see this yellow thing in the back of the stall. And Garfield insists that they stop and ask the shopkeeper what it is. And the keeper thinks it's a joke at first. And then he says, oh, these bumpkins are being serious. That's a banana. Don't you kids know what a banana is? And Garfield and his friend walk away. And then Garfield says to his friend, that man probably thinks, us fools for not knowing what every urchin in this city already knows. But I've vowed never to let a moment to learn a new thing escape my notice, even if I must initially look a fool for doing so. So that again goes back to his intellectual curiosity and his insistence on finding the right answer, sometimes at the expense of self in the moment.
Now he was a self-taught military. He educated himself militarily. He read Napoleonic tactics and probably much else. Here he is in the Civil War. It's a nice Brady photograph.
Yes.
Has, by the way, a revenue stamp on the back. That's what these things had to show that a tax was paid.
Oh, wow.
But there he is. What was he like as an Army officer? And, there were many political generals in that war, and politics was in his blood. How did
Yes.
that inform him as an officer as well?
At the very beginning of the war, he had tremendous foresight. He knew how the war was going to go from the very beginning. State Senator Garfield writes in Columbus, Ohio, on the eve of the war, "May it not be an economy of bloodshed to tell the South that disunion seals the doom of slavery, that if the South forms a government actually based on the monstrous injustice of human slavery, it will be a Cain among the nations of the earth." So he saw in the Civil War, before a lot of other people in the Union, that it would be a very long and bloody conflict and that it would eventually be defined as slavery versus freedom. That aligned with Garfield's politics. He was a radical abolitionist even before the war, but also, and this is a very important point, he saw the personal yields to be gained from winning glory for the North in the Civil War. A friend of his wrote that we are to be ruled by military men for the next 20 years. So Garfield, like a lot, as you put it, political generals of that time, he was a politician in a soldier's garb. He joined the war to yes, secure the policy change that he wanted to see in the country, but he also wanted it to build his national profile. He wanted to use that as a springboard to national prominence. And it worked exactly as he predicted. He was very quickly, he raised a volunteer regiment from his college students, from his parishioners, because he was an abolitionist preacher, and also from his voters, because he was already a state senator. So he had this deep pool of Ohio talent. He used it to form a volunteer regiment, and then he led it to war. And he won glory. He fought a daring campaign in East Kentucky that got him promoted to brigadier general. And then he was at the Battle of Shiloh and he crusaded deeper into the South. And then he got tired of military service. He wrote home, "I am losing great opportunities for growth." And he positioned himself very cleverly in a way to be able to run for a congressional seat back home while serving as a general in the Union Army. Now, he had ideological reasons for doing that too. While Garfield was in the South, again, he was a radical abolitionist. He wanted to be part of this crusading, liberating force going through the South. And that wasn't what the Union Army was doing at that time. Garfield has these stories of having to hide runaway slaves in his own camp against orders because the Union is trying to preserve Southern property rights. He's watching columns of Union troops turning away slaves, at bayonet point back to their fields. Again, because the Union is trying to not interfere with the institution of slavery yet. And so Garfield writes home and he says, I can foresee, this is another case of him being president, I can foresee that winning this war is the smaller of the two conflicts before this nation. There will spring out of this war a host of new dangers and questions, which will be more important to settle than the war itself. So partway through the war, he's already talking about Reconstruction and how important it's going to be to win the peace for the Union. And he also continues on to write, I believe I could do better service on that front in Congress than in the Army. So that's when he makes the transition back. And so his conduct was, and I have a good number of military friends, he committed the cardinal sin of military service, which is to bring politics into it. But by doing that, he also managed to, genuinely perform valiant service.
Let me ask you this. Human beings are contradictory. And the 19th century was certainly an evolving time for many.
Mm.
Lincoln, I know, evolved in that period. And Garfield, of course, as your book points out, was one of those who was very interested in getting the freedmen into soldiery and having them being part of freeing others. But one historian has written and quoted him saying, I could never get myself to fall in love with the creatures. Not a great line, but there it is. So as an historian, how do you react to that sentiment and the contradictory things that a human and Garfield is?
Yes, Absolutely. He's a wonderful an enigma of that time on that issue, given the span of his career. At the very beginning in 1863, when he, lands in Congress, he is a radical Republican, and he is as forward leaning on these issues as almost anyone else of that time. Garfield, was not only in favor, like other radicals, of immediate abolition and equality of citizenship and voting rights, he also wants to redistribute plantation land in the South to former slaves and to what they call loyal whites. And he also founds the first federal Department of Education during Reconstruction, in part as a Reconstruction measure. And he says, while passing this measure in Congress, he says, shall we expand the bounds of citizenship and make no provision to increase the intelligence of the citizen? And he becomes, from that point onward, I'd argue, he becomes more and more detached intellectually and politically from the cause of getting racial rights in America correct and doing well by the freedmen. And I think a nadir of this comes when the 15th Amendment passes and Garfield says, we've now reached that equality of plane of citizenship. He wants to move on because the tide has gone out on Reconstruction. He also, very interestingly, he builds this house in Washington on I Street, deliberately in an area where there is less Black foot traffic. So he has this, he's this strange mix of compassion and forward thinking, but he's still bound by this separation that he wants to maintain from these people he nevertheless intellectually wants to help. And I find him on that issue, like with so many other things, just a perfect encapsulation of the complexity of that time. No one embodies it like he did. And what's interesting, and I end the book on this, and you'll know it as you've read it, is, and this encapsulates that mystery as well. There's a very famous Garfield monument on the shore of Lake Erie. There was another one built around the same time in Arizona, in Bonita Canyon, Arizona. And it was this small sandstone cairn. And each stone was inscribed with a different name and these images of broken chain links and cavalry sabers. And in the middle of this cairn was a slab that read, "In memory of James A. Garfield." And the people who built that were the Buffalo Soldiers, the Black Cavalry Regiment. Now, no one of that time thought to ask the Buffalo Soldiers why they raised that when they did and why they were interested in James A. Garfield, but they did. Now, that monument doesn't stand anymore, but it was taken apart, and actually part of it is still visible in a chimney in the area. But it's a nice encapsulation, yeah, which is there's a lot we could say about that, but it's a nice encapsulation of the mystery of the man and his views and just what people thought of him. And this book was an attempt to just find this rich American life and bring it back into the public view.
Bjorn, I think some people are watching and might have comments.
Yes, we have a lot of people enjoying the talk today, and I'm enjoying it from behind the curtains. But yeah, let's catch up with some of the people that are joining us today. Dan Madsen is watching from Denver, and Dan's a regular, so thank you, Dan. Bill Gorski is watching, and Fernando is watching from Venezuela. So once again, we have an international House Divided going this time. But a little closer to where you are, Charlie, we have Sam Black is in Dayton, Ohio, and has just received a signed copy of the book from us, and very simply asks, what was your favorite discovery about Garfield?
One of my favorite discoveries actually was this incident that he wrote about in the middle of the Civil War. He was fighting in Alabama, and he was again getting disenchanted with the state of the war in his place. And I mentioned this briefly before, but at the height of his discontent, Garfield was a runaway slave ran into Garfield's camp. And Garfield had orders from up the Union command chain to release this slave to their masters in the area, and he refused. And he later said in Congress that he was the first Union officer in the history of the war to resist an order like that. So that was interesting. And then there was a second thing that I found out that was quite fascinating. During the election of 1880, Thomas Edison created the first incandescent elections display in American history in order to show the results of the 1880 election for Garfield. On election night of 1880, Thomas Edison instructed one of his lab assistants to flip, that switch if Garfield was shown to be the winner of the presidential contest. The results came in, Garfield had won, the switch was flipped, and a mile-long stretch of streetlights blinked on. And that was remembered as the first time that we had like an elections display board in American history. And then another thing, I'll give you three for the price of one. Theodore Roosevelt Jr.'s first vote for a president was for James Garfield, and he wrote about that in his honeymoon diary. So it's another interesting few strands of history that all combine.
Great. Well, thank you, Sam. Now, Charlie, we do have a good question coming up here that's going to get us right into the weeds. And I know Dan has been waiting for this, but Jeffrey Bootwell has left us a question, and he gets rather down into the weeds. But sure enough, if that surname sounds familiar to you, Sharp,
yeah, I was going to say
it is.
Yes. All right.
So Jeffrey asked a lot of a question, so I've kind of distilled it. Sorry about that,
Sure.
Jeffrey, but
Yeah.
but he wants to get into the election, and he said, and so I'm going to start right here. What is Charlie's take on how Arthur got selected? Did Garfield play a role in that? Garfield and Boutwell had worked together in the House in the 1860s, and among other things, had co-sponsored legislation establishing the Department of Education to help promote public schools as part of the Reconstruction effort. But really, what Jeffrey wants to get back to is, what's your take on the selection of Garfield? What's Arthur? What's their relationship?
And Charlie,
Right.
before you get into that, a little codicil to that. Thank you, Jeffrey, for that. But when you were describing Garfield's character and conciliatory and wanting to get everyone, that sounded like Arthur.
That
And
sounded like
that's
Arthur,
one of the
yeah.
reasons he was also in the presidency. He was like that as well. Is that one of the reasons they just melded that way?
Yes.
Thanks.
So,
I'm going to step out and let you answer the question.
no, of course. So a critical bit of backstory with this to establish, of course, is that the factionalization of the Republican Party by Garfield's election. Heading into the nominating convention of 1880, you had all of these distinct and wonderfully named blocks of the Republican Party that were competing with different candidates. Arthur's faction, that he actually wasn't really in command of, he was more of a sub-boss of this party, but they were the stalwarts. And the stalwarts were also known as the corruptionists, and they were the unrepentant Republicans who believed not just in extreme policy practices on the standards of the time, but also they believed fundamentally in the abuse of public power as a necessity for playing politics. They were machine politicians. They were people who gave federal jobs to cronies. And the boss of the stalwart faction was Roscoe Conkling, Senator of New York. And one of Boss Conkling, Lord Roscoe's top lieutenants, maybe his top lieutenant, was Chester Arthur, who until recently had been the collector of the customs collector of the Port of New York, which is one of the top federal jobs, and it was just rife with corruption and opportunities for political money. That's right, exactly. So Arthur had actually never been elected to office before he was put on the vice presidential ticket. And after Garfield's surprise victory, because he emerged, and I'm distilling this, but during the election of 1880, at the convention of 1880, he was picked essentially against his will off the floor of the convention as an upset candidate. And he came out of nowhere and he took the nomination. The stalwarts were terribly upset. And in order to heal the party divides, Garfield and his sudden ragtag group of supporters, they needed an olive branch to extend to the stalwarts, to keep them happy and to show them that their interests would be represented in the White House. And one of the ways that Garfield and his supporters did that was they asked Chester Arthur to accept the vice presidential slot. Now, how did they land on Arthur? That's a very good question. As a matter of fact, Arthur was not their first choice. The Ohioans, as they were remembered at the convention, actually went around to a series of stalwarts and threw out the possibility of these other stalwarts being a vice presidential nomination. And to a man, They had each been prevented from doing so by the boss of the stalwarts, Roscoe Conkling, who was one of those great, flamboyant, brutal bosses of the time. Roscoe Conkling was the archetype of political bosses in American history, I'd argue. Anyway, but yes, but and you know fully well, he was flamboyant and he was well dressed and he was debonair and cutting and all these things. Anyway, Arthur gets handed this olive branch. Somebody approaches him with the idea of becoming Garfield's vice president, and he's in a peculiar spot in his life. He had never been elected to anything. He had been just purely a boss and a political operator, and he had recently lost his wife. He was now a widower. And he was somebody who, as I write in the book, who had just a yearning for camaraderie, a affection for the high life, and a moral spine just pliable enough to yield to both of those things. And the vice presidency just intrigued him. It was a perfect role for a man like him. It was something that came with all these pomp and ceremonial duties and all of this glory, but no actual work. And for a lot of American politicians, that sounds like a bad mix. For Arthur, that was ideal. So he goes to Roscoe Conkling. Chester Arthur approaches his boss, and he says, "The Ohioans have offered me the vice presidential slot. What should I do?" And Conkling goes, "If I were you, sir, I would drop it, as I would a red hot shoe from the forge." So, but Arthur, he's too curious, and he accepts, and he rejects Conkling, and they have this stormy breaking apart. It was not a permanent fracturing of their ties. The two men actually lived together in DC in a house on 14th Street called the Morgue, which shows you their reputation at the time. But so Arthur accepts the vice presidential slot. Garfield and him do not really know each other. They cross paths barely, but the expectation was that it would be a distant working relationship. And in the aftermath, a lot of reformists, a lot of clean government activists in the Republican Party write about how appalled they are that Garfield, who they thought was one of their own, would choose such a corrupt figure as his vice president. But there's this great editorial that is written by a leader of the reformists, E.L. Godkin. And E.L. Godkin writes, "It is true that something might befall President Garfield during his term, but there is no reason to suspect that anything fatal would lead to him not being able to fulfill his duties." Basically saying, don't worry about Arthur. Nothing's going to happen to Garfield. We'll be fine. And that was a phenomenal case of jinxing it, as I've ever seen it historically. But I got to say, Bootwell, fantastic last name. And how phenomenal that, we get a question from one of those families.
I'm going to jump ahead for something. I have so much else I wanted to get into first, but since we're on Arthur, one of my favorite presidential stories, anecdotes maybe, is Calvin Coolidge. And he was in the Oval Office with Senator William Borah out of Idaho. And he looked across the street, Coolidge did, looked out the window, and there was his vice president, Charles Dawes, walking across Pennsylvania Avenue. And so Coolidge said, "There goes the vice president with nothing on his mind but my health." So
yeah,
I'm going to ask, what was on Arthur's mind when after Garfield was shot? What was he thinking? How did he feel?
He was in a state of pure terror. Chester Arthur, God bless him, was in probably one of the worst circumstantial situations that a person can find themselves. He was somebody who had accepted the vice presidency with the full expectation of 4 years of no drama. Instead, as soon as the Garfield administration begins, the stalwarts, led by Conkling, and Garfield have this massive falling out. And this fight eventually resolves itself. Arthur takes the side against his president. He sides with his Senate bosses rather than President Garfield. And but that fight ends up leading to the stalwarts losing. They lose power. But in that aftermath of that loss, political tensions had been so hyped up, and rhetoric of that period was so toxic that a mentally ill person stalks Garfield, shoots Garfield in the back under the deranged calculations that by shooting Garfield, now President Arthur would be so grateful that he would give the shooter whatever job in government the shooter wanted. And the shooter said at the scene, I am a stalwart, and now Arthur is president. And so Arthur finds out about this in Manhattan, and he is immediately floored. One, he's just been blamed by an assassin, a presidential assassin, for, or at least implied to be involved in the murder of the president. Two, Arthur would, and I think this is worth a little bit of qualification because things might have changed in our relatively recent past, but he was objectively the least qualified executive we had ever had in the nation by that point. He had never been elected to anything until the vice presidency, and he was genuinely afraid of the idea of him taking up that office. He was terrified by it. He knew that the nation distrusted him, to say the least. He knew that he was being blamed for what had happened to the president, and he was embarrassed. So he went into hiding. He hid in his townhome in Manhattan. He would spend quite a lot of his time in tears. His friends said that they had never seen Arthur in such a state as since his wife died. And he was genuinely this compassionate individual who had been dealt a very difficult hand. And so he's hiding in his townhome in New York. And he is being, on a daily basis, he's opening his papers to find himself being lambasted as incompetent or corrupt or a mixture of all of the above. And he receives a letter from a woman who says, basically, the whole country is in mourning. Do you realize why? It's not just because of Garfield State, it's because you're taking over for Garfield, which is a brutal way to open a letter. But then she writes on, this woman's name is Julia Sand. And she writes on and she says, but there is an opportunity for you yet. Use this as a chance for, as she puts it, reform, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. She says, the way you've led your life can now go through this inflection point. You can make the most of this grand opportunity. And skipping a little bit further ahead, Arthur uses this letter and he holds on to this letter. And he decides that when he does inherit the presidency, he is going to be a changed man. And he's one of the very rare circumstances, I think, in American history where the office made him into who he was. And he uses his power, in part in office, to sign civil service reform legislation in honor of the murdered Garfield, to do away with these corrupt machine structures and stalwart structures that enabled his own rise to power. He cleans up, or he begins the cleaning up of machine politics from the federal system. And so a line was written of Arthur, that he was, no man ever went into the White House more widely distrusted, and no one ever left more generally respected. So it's one of the rare moments of, the office making the man. And also another thing, the press kind of fell in love with him. And there was this anecdote going around during Arthur's administration that he had this daily ritual of putting flowers before a mystery woman's portrait. And everybody was trying to guess who this was because he was now a bachelor president. And then all of the speculation turned into, as I put it, tearful awe when the country realizes that the woman who he's laying flowers in front of is his deceased wife. And so he's still devoted to her, even in his own White House, even without her.
Maybe your next book is going to be, taking over from Reeves's book, Gentleman Boss. Maybe Arthur is your next book. But, this era from antebellum, during the war, the Gilded Age, is just filled with characters and stories. And that's why a bookshop like mine, specializing in Lincoln the Civil War, can survive, because there's so many stories going on in the 19th century that you can take a lifetime reading and enjoying. Arthur's one of them, and many others in this book, by the way, are as well. And you flesh out a number of good stories of people in there. Now, I want to switch a little bit because I happen to have a document I've never had before, I hadn't seen before. This is one that is called The Army of Boys in Blue. And here is James Garfield as the commander-in-chief. This is a GAR type post-war political arm for the veterans. And there he was as commander-in-chief of one of those arms. Now, he was also chosen to give the keynote speech in May of 1865 at the first Decoration Day in Arlington Cemetery.
Yes.
And he noted with irony that there they were on the grounds of the leading general who raised his sword
Yes.
against his country, as you're right.
You can see the
He was
radical.
also then active in the GIR, as I said.
Right.
Oratory had to have been part of this. He not only was a fine reader, and maybe because of all that reading and writing, he became a good orator. Tell us about that and how his inaugural address came about, what he said in there as president.
He was a very good orator. Part of that was his intellectual depth. Part of that was also his spiritual background. One of the key ways that he improved his rhetoric from his early experiences in schooling was preaching, because he had joined a congregation, the Disciples of Christ, that put a lot of emphasis on laymen, like regular attendees, preaching of their own. And so Garfield became a very good preacher. And you can see from all of his youthful experiences the development of somebody who spoke with almost religious passion, somebody who is also very keen and almost militantly keen on acknowledging the perspectives of everybody in the room. That was something he did growing up in a lot of debating societies. And then he had just such a font of just reading and intellectual knowledge that helped him flesh these things out with, intellectual concepts. So you had a very complete orator. He was remembered as one of the great orators at that time. His inaugural address, Garfield had spent months ahead of his inauguration studying the inaugural addresses of each of his predecessors. That was very much his style. He did not leave things to chance. The only one, by the way, that he found passable was Lincoln's. So that was the one that he decided was the only one worth emulation. But he ends up throwing away his drafts the day before his inauguration. He writes it out near midnight on the morning of. And his address is a prophetic and very carefully worded review of what's essentially what he writes as a century of national progress, just past a century since the first written Constitution. And he speaks of both the progress and the peril before the nation. He acknowledges deep wounds that have been made over the course of his own lifetime. But he acknowledges injustices that continue. He talks about continued racial repression in the South. He talks about the dangers of illiteracy in a nation where the ballot is now more widespread. But he splits the difference and he uses it as this chance to declare that the nation is tired of fighting, that as he says, that it's time to yield to our children, to give to our children a better vision of the destiny of the republic. And it's very prophetic too. So he endorses universal public education. He writes of the need to safeguard civil rights. He says that to take away the sovereignty of voters should be treated not unlike in the old countries to compass the death of the king. That was the scale in which he compared vote repression. He said it was not unlike regicide. That was how. But then again, he measures all of that by saying, "I will do everything within my constitutional power to restrict this." He also says, strangely enough, that it would be a good idea to build a canal connecting Atlantic and Pacific Oceans across Central America. So, it's bizarre, but so it was a wonderful piece of oratory that actually, in the aftermath of his death, and we might get into this in a little bit, it becomes part of the Garfield myth, because it sketches out a vision of the Republic that is so pie in the sky and so optimistic that in the aftermath of his death, Garfield starts to be remembered, not unlike Kennedy after Kennedy's assassination. He starts to be remembered on a very different scale, I think, than the man himself was politically at that time. So, but it's one of the best inaugural addresses, I think, of all time, from my totally subjective viewpoint, of course. And it shows off his depth of intellect and his skill as a writer and speaker.
We started off this interview and you mentioned how getting to this book, partially because of the times we are living in today. And it was certainly a divided time in Lincoln's time. Can't get more divided than Civil War. And certainly there was transition in the politics, the parties, during the time of the 1880 convention. How would you compare then the divided times of then with today? And is there something that we can learn from the what you've learned writing about Garfield and his time?
Yes, I'd say I'm reminded of the Mark Twain quote that history doesn't often repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme a lot. And in the conditions of American society at the time of Garfield's life, you had tremendous socioeconomic division. You had this was the Gilded Age. This was the rise of the robber barons through the tech moguls of that time, and in contrast with severe economic distress being experienced by other Americans, particularly immigrants of that period. You had political polarization, not just between Republicans and Democrats, although that obviously meant very different things back then, but between Republicans of that period, even to the extent that in 1876, we had the first, what I'd say is disputed presidential election in American history, meaning the first election where in the aftermath, the losing party, claimed fraud, threatened civil war over the results. And then, of course, you had racial tension, and this perspective of Garfield's time that was emerging, but already had its roots deep in society, that there was technically equal rights across the races in America, at least from a legal perspective, but practically divisions were already occurring. And it's easy to see, I think, the connective tissue between those events and our modern ones. Garfield was, just from a political perspective, he was a great manager of those crises. He was a worker of the gears, a pleasant, pragmatic, and approachable person who was trying to ride the currents of the times and take victories for progressive causes when he would. And so I think actually there are two things to really take away from his life and everything he did. First is that there's a lot of rhetoric these days about America going through an unprecedented series of divisions and crises. And when we look at the scale of what happened over the course of Garfield's life and the events he influenced, we realize that's not entirely true. These are not entirely unprecedented. In ways both reassuring and not, we've been through many of these things before. And second, I'd say the way Garfield led, and I'll go back to this, he was a fantastic example of what it looks like when a pathologically reasonable person is in power in Washington. You'll often hear people complain today about, in privacy, there's a lot of rhetoric about Americans complaining that people in Washington aren't doing the common sense things. They're not coming together and they're not just hashing things out. Garfield's a very good look at what it is when an American politician defines their positions and their approach to the business of public statecraft on the idea of getting things done. And what you have as a result of that is a chimera of a man and a chimera of a time, where you get all of these complexities and contradictions all embodied in a person. And it makes for, I might say, a terrific biographical subject.
Well, one of the issues of the day, there are numbers of them: reform, which you mentioned a bit. We don't have really the time to get into that, but the book does. Another, though, is immigration. We seem to have that problem today, and I guess they had it back then. The Chinese Exclusion Act,
yes,
is certainly one that pops to mind. What was his thought on immigration?
Yeah, I'd argue Garfield wasn't bullish on European immigration. He was less bullish on Chinese immigration, which was very common, by the way, in the Republican Party. The Republican Party saw in the influx of Chinese labor to the West, they saw it as, if I might distill, they saw it as a return possibly of slavery to the Republic, which was a backwards view, to say the least. But they were very worried about what the influx of cheap migrant labor from China would do to white, blue-collar American workers. And so, again, that's another piece of connective tissue. Garfield, one of the great issues of his campaign was when this letter emerged purporting to be from him, that claimed that companies should have rights to hire whatever type of labor they wanted, and it was called the Maury Letter, and that what it said was an incredibly controversial position because it seemed like Garfield was endorsing the right of American companies to hire cheap Chinese labor. And so he wasn't terribly, he was definitely backwards looking when it came to that issue. But you raised the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is a great example of, again, relevance, because Arthur signed that into law. And it actually was used as precedent when President Trump decided to exclude immigrants from Muslim majority nations back at the beginning of his administration. And there's an irony there as well, because when Chester Arthur, I was talking about this earlier today with another audience, when Chester Arthur was running for vice president with Garfield in 1880, conspiracy theories abounded that Arthur, who is from Vermont, was secretly a Canadian and was therefore not qualified to be vice president of the United States. So, we can't really get away from those theories even back then.
Talking about, well, we're not talking about, but here we are sitting in the Abraham Lincoln bookshop. And I just wrote down a few random similarities of Lincoln and Garfield. Both were ambitious, something off the wall. Both went to Niagara Falls and wrote about it. Lincoln was interested in Euclidean logic, whereas, as you mentioned, the Pythagorean theorem was something Garfield could just whip right through.
Right.
That's amazing. They were both astute politicians, had good oratory, and I don't think that people especially compare Garfield and Lincoln. I have heard more comparisons of Garfield and Kennedy. So what was the relationship with Lincoln that Garfield had?
Complicated.
And did he change his mind? We're already past our time, but I'd like to at least end with maybe Mr. Lincoln.
No, it's a very good one because it was complicated. At the first time Garfield laid eyes on Lincoln, it was when Garfield was a state senator in Columbus and Lincoln was coming through town. And Garfield didn't think very highly of him then, but he wrote a feeling inspired by the moment of the times and how exciting it was that the inauguration of Lincoln could herald Civil War. Then you fast forward and Garfield is this general turned congressman, and he has to ask for Lincoln's advice on whether to continue in the army or join Congress. Then Garfield joins Congress and he becomes a fierce critic of Lincoln because he's a radical and he thinks that Lincoln is mismanaging this war and is a blight upon the Union, and that he's spoiling this effort to make a more righteous republic. And then Lincoln is assassinated, and all of a sudden Garfield is memorializing him as one of the great lost statesmen of human history. And then you fast forward to Garfield's administration, and who he picks as his Secretary of War? Robert Todd Lincoln, the last surviving son of Abraham. And he does that because Robert Todd Lincoln is not frankly qualified for the job. But he does that because he wants to, again, just lash this Republican Party together again based on tradition. And who is present at Garfield's assassination? Robert Todd Lincoln. And Robert Todd Lincoln, as Secretary of War, is present in the train station. He watches Garfield get shot and he secures the area under his official duties. And then he says to a reporter outside, "How many hours of suffering I have passed in this town." And again, the strands of history run so deep, and it's complicated because another thing that binds Garfield and Lincoln together, they were the first and second presidents to be assassinated. And each, I'd argue, there was almost a yin-yang aspect of their assassinations because Garfield's was viewed through the lens of Lincoln's, and it was seen as this counterweight. Lincoln was the assassination of a president during wartime. Garfield was the assassination of a president during peacetime. And those two together, happening within 20 years of each other, that sobered the nation. That made them realize that that they were now entering a less innocent era. And now our presidents would no longer be regular citizens again. So there's a lot of connective tissue there.
It's not surprising that when Lincoln was assassinated, the iconography was Washington and Lincoln together. When Garfield was assassinated, Lincoln,
Lincoln.
and Garfield together.
Yes.
When McKinley was assassinated, it was the three of them.
Yes, yes, it
Lincoln,
was.
Garfield, and McKinley in the iconography quite a bit.
Yeah.
Other things, of course, is that Garfield, John Hay makes his name in
course.
this book. And of course, Garfield stayed with Salmon P. Chase in his home,
He did.
which was a surprise to me.
And he heard from Salmon P. Chase every qualm that Salmon P. Chase had with Lincoln as well. And so
I bet he did.
yeah.
I am surprised, Garfield being a handsome man that he was, that he and Kate didn't get together, because she was there, I think, at the house at the same time.
She did, and he wrote a little bit about that, but he was already married, and even though he wasn't entirely loyal by that point, he would never countenance. He knew where his bread was buttered. He didn't.
Yeah,
he
but
didn't-
that was not his relationship with another woman.
Yes.
It was not with Kate.
Not with Kate, no, with
Would
somebody
have been
else.
easy.
Would have been easy, yes. But you know who did chase Kate was Roscoe Conkling. There's this anecdote of Salmon Chase chasing Roscoe Conkling with a shotgun off his lawn. So funny.
I would have done the same thing.
Yeah, I would have.
Conklin, for heaven's sakes.
I would have too, even if I didn't have a daughter. I would have done it.
Well, there is so much in this book, Charlie. Thank you for this. It's a wonderful narrative history that touches so many different bases, has good stories in it. And of course, we'll come with our special Abraham Lincoln Bookshop book plates signed by Charlie. Next time we hope to have you here in the shop. Our logo at the top was done by Carl Sandburg for his prairie years back in 1926. But we were able to obtain this, or Ralph Newman was, in 1938 when we started to specialize in Lincoln and the Civil War.
Oh, phenomenal.
Thank you
That's
very
great.
much for being with us. I think this is the book to read now on Garfield, and it's such a fascinating time. And I now understand more of how he was a connective tissue for this entire era.
He was.
So thank you again, and appreciate your being on A House Divided here at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop.
Oh, thank you. The pleasure was all mine. So thanks so much.
All right. Thank you. And let me also add my thanks, Charlie, for joining us today. And so for those of you who are watching, you can still order a signed first edition copy, as Daniel has stated. There's a link there in the comments, and so you can click right on through. You can order it. If you are watching this later on our YouTube channel, I'm going to put a link in the description of the video so that you can still order a signed first edition copy of President Garfield. So thank you, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we will see you next time on A House Divided.